As a detective in the Little Rock Police Department's cold case unit, Ginny was accustomed to ghosts. The files on her desk were filled with them. Unsolved murders, missing persons, and forgotten families. Each folder was a sealed tomb, and it was Ginny's job to find the key. She was currently staring at a case that had haunted the department for a decade, the Riverfront Strangler, a series of unsolved homicides, where victims were found along the Arkansas River, each case growing colder with every passing year. Her partner, Ben, a man as quiet and steady as Ginny was boisterous, cleared his throat from the other side of the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. "Another dead end, Ginny?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Just ghosts, Ben," she replied, not looking up, the kind that whispers from old files and faded photographs. But this time, a faint flicker of hope sparked. A new piece of forensic technology had been approved, allowing them to re-examine old evidence. A single strand of hair found clutched in the hand of the first victim was now being reanalyzed. It was a long shot, but Ginny knew that sometimes all it took was one thread to unravel a decade of silence. A smile touched the corners of Ginny's lips. "Finn, if you weren't such a good boy, I'd say you were mocking me." Her partner, a magnificent German shepherd, lifted his head from his paws, his intelligent brown eyes fixed on her. Finn wasn't just her canine partner. He was her shadow, her confidant, and her most reliable tool. Trained in human remains detection, he had a nose that could find secrets buried for decades. He gave a soft, inquiring whine as if asking for the rundown. Ginny sighed, pushing the file folder aside. "It's the Riverfront Strangler case. The new tech came through. We're getting a hit on that strand of hair." Finn's ears perked up, a clear sign of his attention. He padded over to her desk, nudging her hand with his wet nose. He knew her moods, and the shift from weary resignation to a flicker of hope was as clear to him as the scent of a new trail. "Yes, boy," she said, scratching him behind the ears. "It's a long shot, but it's a lead. And for the first time in a long time, the ghosts of the Riverfront Strangler might finally have a name." She stood up, grabbed her car keys, and clipped Finn's lead to his collar. "Let's go," she said, her voice filled with a renewed sense of purpose. "We've got work to do." Ginny and Finn arrived at the crime lab, the sterile air a stark contrast to the humid Arkansas evening. The lab was a world of sterile surfaces and glowing screens, a place where the past could be meticulously dissected. Dr. Eris Thorne, a forensic geneticist with a reputation for his almost inhuman patience, met them at the door. "Ginny, Finn," he said, offering a curt nod to the dog, who in turn gave a polite little tail wag. "I've got something for you. The hair strand. I ran it through the new sequencing process. The sample was small, but we got a hit in the genetic database." Jeannie's heart hammered against her ribs. After 10 years of dead ends, this felt unreal. "A name?" she asked, her voice tight with anticipation. "Not exactly," Thorne replied, leading them to a monitor. He typed a few commands, and a complex web of familial connections appeared on the screen. "The sample belongs to a male individual, but they're not in the system. However, we have a close match. A sibling, most likely." He pointed to a highlighted name on the screen. "That's their brother. Name is Silas Finch. He has a record for petty theft, served time in Texarkana 10 years ago. Right around the time of the first murder." Ginny's gaze was fixed on the name, a tangible connection to a ghost she had been chasing for years. Silas Finch. The name felt heavy, a key to a locked door. She looked down at Finn, whose ears were now perked, his eyes fixed on her. He could sense the shift in her mood, the thrilling jolt of a breakthrough. "Silas Finch," she repeated, the name tasting like a lead she could finally sink her teeth into. "Let's go find him, boy." The name Silas Finch was a hook that had finally caught. Ginny stood, a jolt of pure adrenaline shooting through her veins. Finn, sensing the change in her demeanor, let out a low, excited woof. Texarkana, Ginny said, her voice a low murmur. That's a long way for a petty thief to go. Dr. Thorne pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. He served time there. 10 years ago. He could have just moved back to Little Rock, or he could be anywhere. But the genetic match is a solid lead. He's related to the perpetrator. Close relation, you said? Ginny pressed. Statistically, it's a sibling, Thorne confirmed. But there's always a margin of error. It could be a first cousin. It's a familial search, not a direct match. The killer's DNA isn't in the system. But his brother's is... Ginny's mind raced. A sibling. That explained why the original investigators had never found a direct link. The perpetrator's DNA wouldn't have been in a database for a petty crime, but his brother's would. The strand of hair wasn't from the killer, but from a close family member who had been at the scene, perhaps in an innocent capacity, and had left it behind. Or, more likely, it was from the killer himself, and the genetic link was what mattered. The possibilities were endless, but for the first time in a decade, they had a solid physical trail to follow. All right, Finn, Ginny said, giving him a firm pat on the head. Looks like we're taking a little road trip. Let's see if Mr. Finch wants to have a chat about his family. As they left the lab and stepped out into the humid Little Rock air, Ginny felt a renewed sense of purpose. The cold case wasn't so cold anymore. It had a name, a location, and a new scent for her and Finn to track. The ghosts of the Riverfront Strangler were finally starting to stir. The Little Rock Police Department's digital records were a sprawling maze of interconnected databases, and Ginny navigated them with practiced ease. Finn settled at her feet, his head resting on her shoe. She cross-referenced the name, Silas Finch, with every available record. His petty theft charge 10 years ago was the most significant entry, but a few other details surfaced. A series of parking violations, a traffic ticket for a broken taillight, and a single outdated address on the outskirts of Texarkana. He's a ghost, Ginny muttered, pulling up his mugshot. Silas Finch was a man with a sharp, angular face and deep-set eyes that seemed to hold a world of secrets. No social media presence, no recent address changes. It's like he dropped off the face of the earth after his stint in jail, but Ginny knew that no one truly disappears. They simply become harder to find. She spent the next hour working the phone, calling the Texarkana Police Department, the Pulaski County Sheriff's Office, and even the Probation and Parole Office. It was a tedious process of speaking to indifferent operators and leaving messages that might never be returned. Finally, a grizzled voice on the other end of the line, a sergeant from the Texarkana PD, offered a sliver of hope. Silas Finch? Yeah, I remember him, the sergeant said, his voice a low drawl. Served his time, got out, and then nothing. He was a loner. But I heard he was a sculptor. Worked with metal, something like that. Ginny's hand stilled over her keyboard. Sculptor. The name felt strangely apt. A man who worked with his hands, shaping and molding things. She ran a quick search, this time for Silas Finch and sculptor, and a new set of results populated her screen. An article from a local art blog, dated 2 years prior, featured a small-town artist whose work was gaining a cult following. The article mentioned he had a small studio in a converted warehouse in Texarkana and was known for his intricate, sometimes macabre metal sculptures. All right, Finn, Ginny said, the glint in her eye returning. Looks like our ghost isn't a ghost after all. He's an artist. Let's go see what he's been sculpting. The drive from Little Rock to Texarkana was a 2-hour journey that Ginny had made many times before, usually for conferences or to assist in a joint task force. This time, however, the miles felt charged with a different kind of purpose. I-30 West stretched before them, a long ribbon of asphalt cutting through the green rolling hills of Arkansas. Finn, ever the professional, was curled in the passenger seat, his head resting on the console, but his ears were twitching, picking up on the subtle shift in Ginny's mood. "We're on a hunt, boy," she murmured, scratching his head. He gave a soft grunt in response, a sound that Ginny understood perfectly. They arrived in Texarkana as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple. The address from the art blog led them to a quiet, industrial area on the edge of town. The studio was a repurposed auto body shop, its corrugated metal walls covered in graffiti and rust. The faint scent of welding and scorched metal hung in the air. Ginny put the car in park and unclipped Finn's lead. "All right, partner," she said, her voice dropping to a low, serious tone. "Time to do what you do best. Let's see if we can smell a ghost." Finn's tail gave a slow, deliberate wag. He was already in work mode, his nose twitching, taking in the myriad of scents, oil, dust, and something else. A faint, metallic tang. Ginny walked him slowly around the perimeter of the building, her eyes scanning the windows and doors. The place was dark, but a faint golden light emanated from a window in the back. She gestured towards the main door, and Finn, without hesitation, padded forward. His nose was to the ground, his body language a taut line of focus. He sniffed along the bottom of the door, his tail giving a single quick thump against the metal. Then he lifted his head and looked at Ginny, a quiet intensity in his eyes. "He's here," the look said. "The scent is fresh." Ginny took a deep breath, a taste of hope and dread mixing on her tongue. She reached for the walkie-talkie in her belt. "Unit 23, I've got a visual on the studio. Looks like our man's home. Requesting backup." After the backup arrived and secured the perimeter, Ginny, with Finn at her side, approached the front door of the studio. She knocked, the sound echoing in the silent night. After a long moment, a voice from inside called out, "It's open!" Ginny pushed the heavy door open, a bell jingling faintly overhead. The air was thick with the smell of metal dust and turpentine. The space was a chaotic wonderland of twisted metal and half-finished sculptures. In the center of the room, a man was hunched over a work table, a welding torch in his hand, a shower of sparks illuminating his face. It was Silas Finch, his face a perfect match to the grainy mugshot. He lowered the torch and pulled off his safety goggles, his eyes as dark and deep as the secrets they held, fixed on Ginny and Finn. "Can I help you, officers?" he asked, his voice calm, almost detached. "Silas Finch?" Ginny asked, her gaze sweeping the room. "That's me," he said, gesturing to a finished sculpture of a tangled, skeletal bird. "Do you like it? It's called Tangled Truths." Ginny ignored the morbid joke. "My name is Detective O'Malley, and this is my partner, Detective Finch." She gestured to the German shepherd, whose body was a tense coil of quiet readiness. "We're with the Little Rock Cold Case Unit. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your brother." Silas's face remained impassive. "My brother? I don't have a brother." Ginny's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment. "The genetic markers say you do, Mr. Finch. They say that 10 years ago, a piece of your family was left at a crime scene where a number of people were murdered along the Arkansas River. The Riverfront Strangler case." Silas's eyes flickered just for a second. It was all the confirmation Ginny needed. "I told you I don't have a brother," he repeated, his voice harder now. "And I don't know anything about any murders. I was in Texarkana, serving my time for a petty crime while all that was going on." "Your brother wasn't," Ginny said, her voice dropping to a low, intense tone. "His DNA was found at the scene, Silas. We know he's your family, and we're going to find him. But if you tell us where he is, if you help us, maybe we can help you." A slow smile crept across Silas's face, a chilling, knowing smirk. He picked up a small, grotesque metal hand he was working on. Help me? I'm not the one who needs help, Detective. My brother, he's a part of me, a part of my art. You can't separate us. He raised the hand, and Finn, a low growl rumbling in his chest, tensed, his eyes locked on Silas's every move. Because he's not my brother, Silas said, his voice a whisper. He's me. The chilling admission hung in the air, heavier than the metal sculptures that surrounded them. Ginny's hand instinctively went to the pistol at her hip, not to draw it, but as a point of anchor. Her mind, however, was already racing through the implications. A familial match that was actually a direct, albeit incomplete, hit on the killer's DNA. Silas Finch hadn't been a ghost, a witness, or a sibling. He was the ghost. The art, Ginny said, her voice barely a whisper as her eyes swept over the grotesque, tangled figures. All this time you've been sculpting the victims. Silas gave a slow nod, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. The art is a part of the process, Detective. You see, I don't just kill them, I make them live forever. And here, he gestured to a half-finished piece that looked like a bird, but with a human-like hand for a beak. Tangled truths, you called it, Ginny said. Or is it tangled DNA? A fleeting look of surprise crossed Silas's face before a chilling smile replaced it. You're a clever one, Detective, but you're missing a part of the story. Just then, a flash of movement from the far side of the studio caught Ginny's eye. A tall, gaunt man, his face a pale mirror of Silas's, emerged from the shadows. He was holding a metal sculpture, and it was pointed directly at Ginny. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense, but the sharpened, jagged edges of the abstract sculpture were a clear and immediate threat. Finn let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that rumbled up from deep within his chest. The hair on his back stood on end, a clear sign of a new threat. This is my brother Elias, Silas said, a manic glee in his voice. We're two parts of the same whole. He does the heavy lifting. I do the art. Ginny's mind worked in overdrive. The DNA profile. It wasn't a sibling, it was an identical twin. The perfect ghost, two people with the same genetic code. Silas, with a petty crime record, would have left a DNA sample in the system, but his twin, Elias, would not have. One twin committed the murders, the other provided the DNA link to a false trail, a crime that wasn't a murder. Elias, Ginny said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. The genetic markers don't lie, but they don't always tell the whole truth either. Elias's grip on the metal sculpture tightened. You don't know anything about us. I know enough, Ginny said, taking a slow step to the side, positioning herself between the twins and the door. I know that one of you is a killer, and the other is a monster who helps him get away with it. Finn, sensing the escalating danger, took a small, low step forward, his body poised to strike. The standoff was a silent, lethal triangle. Ginny, the twins, and the faithful German shepherd who was ready to protect his partner at all costs. The ghosts of the Riverfront Strangler weren't just in the files anymore. They were standing right in front of her. The silence in the workshop was punctuated only by the low rumble in Finn's chest. Ginny's hand remained steady on her belt, her gaze flicking between Silas, the artist, and Elias, the enforcer. Both men held the same cold, dead-eyed stare, a reflection of a shared, twisted psyche. It wasn't just your DNA, Silas, Ginny said, her voice a calm, deliberate counterpoint to the rising tension. We found a new way to analyze the hair sample. It didn't just give us a genetic profile, it gave us a familial profile. It told us there was a close match. And it told us you had a twin. Silas's smirk widened. A beautiful little mistake of nature, isn't it? One person, two bodies. It kept us safe all this time. Nothing keeps you safe forever, Ginny replied. Your petty crime record left a trail. Elias's DNA would never have been in the system, but yours was, and it was enough. The hair on the victim's hand, it wasn't a witness's hair. It was a trophy. As Ginny spoke, she subtly shifted her weight, preparing for a move. She knew that any sudden action could trigger a violent response from the twins. Finn, his body still and his eyes locked on Elias, was a coiled spring of controlled aggression. You're not going anywhere, Detective, Elias said, his voice a low hiss as he tightened his grip on the metal sculpture. And neither is your mutt. Before he could take another step, Finn let out a sharp, decisive bark. It was the command signal. In a flash, he was no longer a shadow at Ginny's side. He was a blur of black and tan fur leaping forward. He didn't go for Elias's legs or arms, but for the metal sculpture in his hand. With a well-placed snap of his powerful jaws, he clamped down on the twisted metal, the sound of grinding teeth and tearing metal echoing through the room. Elias let out a cry of pain and surprise, his grip on the sculpture gone as Finn wrenched it from his hand. The diversion was all Ginny needed. As Elias stumbled back, clutching his now useless hand, Ginny was already moving, her voice a sharp command. Freeze! Get on the ground! Silas, however, saw his chance. He lunged for a nearby workbench, his hand reaching for a blowtorch, but Ginny was faster. She swung a heavy metal bar, a piece of a half-finished sculpture, and brought it down on his outstretched hand. The sound of a bone cracking was sickeningly loud. Silas screamed, his face contorted in pain and rage. He fell to the floor, his other hand clutching the broken one. Elias, disoriented and wounded, looked on in stunned silence. The standoff was over. The cold case was finally hot. Ginny stood over them, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Finn, having dropped the mangled sculpture, was now standing over Elias, a low growl still rumbling in his chest. The sirens of the backup units wailed in the distance, a familiar and welcome sound. The ghosts of the Riverfront Strangler had finally been laid to rest. But as Ginny looked at the two men on the floor, she knew the case wasn't just about a cold trail and a new technology. It was about the terrifying, tangled truths that lay hidden in plain sight. The Texarkana police, alerted by Ginny's request for backup, arrived in force. The twins were cuffed and led out of the studio, their silence a stark contrast to the wailing sirens. As they were put into separate patrol cars, Ginny and Finn began the methodical and thorough process of searching the property. The search and questioning. The first priority was to document the crime scene. Ginny meticulously photographed every sculpture, every tool, and every twisted piece of metal. Finn, working on a separate lead, sniffed along the walls, his tail wagging when he found something. His nose led them to a hidden compartment behind a large sheet of plywood. Inside, they found a small metal box, expertly welded shut. Meanwhile, back at the station, the interrogation began. Ginny took Silas, the talkative artist, while her partner from Little Rock, Detective Mason, questioned Elias, the silent enforcer. Silas was arrogant and dismissive, seeing himself as a genius caught by mere mortals. He bragged about the art and the process, a sick narrative of control and creation. He confessed that he'd used his knowledge of the metalworking trade to create makeshift tools to subdue and kill the victims. He even laughed when Ginny mentioned how the initial DNA testing failed to link him to the crimes. You see, Detective, Silas said, Elias did the work. He was the blank canvas. I just told him what to do. And the hair on the first victim's hand? Ginny asked. Whose was that? Silas smiled, a chilling, triumphant expression. We're identical, Detective. Our DNA is exactly the same. But that's where the art comes in. I pulled a single hair from my head and left it for you. I knew my record would be in the system, and that would give you the scent. But I also knew the genetic profiling would only tell you that it belonged to a male individual with a connection to me. It's the perfect misdirection. It's a ghost. At that moment, Ginny's phone buzzed with a message from Mason. Elias confessed. He said Silas told him to kill them. He kept a journal of every murder. Ginny's heart sank. She realized Silas wasn't just a monster, he was a master manipulator who had used his own brother as a tool. A chilling discovery. Ginny ended the interrogation and returned to the studio with the blowtorch. A police technician carefully cut open the metal box Finn had discovered. Inside, they found a collection of personal items from each victim: a worn leather wallet, a delicate silver locket, a pair of reading glasses, and a small faded photograph. The last item was a lock of braided hair, a macabre trophy from the final victim. Ginny looked at the small pile of stolen lives, her eyes welling with tears. For years, these missing items had been a source of pain for the victims' families, a symbol of their loved ones' disappearance. Now, they were a tangible reminder of the twins' depravity. As she stared at the lock of hair, Ginny felt a wave of cold resolve. The case was closed. The monsters were in custody, but the true work of healing was just beginning. Ginny stood by her patrol car, the metal box clutched in her hands, as the twins were loaded into separate vehicles. The flash of the camera from the crime scene investigator illuminated their faces for a brief, horrifying second. Elias, the quiet enforcer, looked defeated, his eyes downcast. But Silas, the artist, held his head high, a smirk still playing on his lips, a final performance for his audience. The ride to Little Rock. Ginny and Finn got into their own patrol car, preparing for the long ride back to Little Rock. The night was now quiet, the frantic energy of the bust having faded. The two patrol cars, one with Elias and the other with Silas, drove ahead of them. Ginny watched the cars ahead, not just as a matter of procedure, but as a final piece of her psychological profile. Elias in the front car sat rigidly, his shoulders slumped. When they passed a brightly lit diner on the outskirts of Texarkana, his head snapped to the side and a visible shudder ran through him. He then quickly turned his head away and stared straight ahead. Silas in the second car was a different story. He seemed to be enjoying the ride, his head moving from side to side as he looked at the passing scenery, as if he was a tourist. His smug expression only faltered for a second when they passed a junkyard piled high with twisted metal and rusted cars. His gaze lingered on the heaps of scrap, and for a brief moment, the calm facade shattered, replaced by a flicker of something close to anger or frustration. Ginny made a note of both reactions in her mind. Elias was scared of the mundane, the sight of a normal, happy life in the diner. Silas, however, was bothered by something much more personal: the discarded metal, the unsculpted chaos of the junkyard. When they finally arrived at the Little Rock Police Department, Ginny had her theories. Elias's fear of the ordinary suggested the murders were not random acts of rage, but a grotesque, distorted imitation of normal human relationships, twisted by Silas's direction. Silas's reaction to the junkyard showed a deep-seated contempt for unsculpted matter, for anything that lacked his specific twisted artistic touch. The Riverfront Strangler case was now closed, but for Ginny, the deeper mystery of the twins' minds was just beginning. She knew that to truly understand the case, she had to understand the men who committed the crimes and why they were driven to do so. And she was determined to unravel every last tangled truth. After processing the twins and putting them in separate holding cells, Ginny retreated to her office, Finn, exhausted from the long day, collapsed onto his bed in the corner, a soft, contented sigh escaping him. Ginny pulled up the twins' files on her computer, the new information from their arrest now added to the existing data. She needed to understand not just what they had done, but why. The interrogation. The following morning, Ginny started with Elias. He was quiet, withdrawn, and visibly shaking. Ginny spoke to him with a calm, even tone, avoiding the aggressive interrogation techniques often used on suspects. She asked him about his past, his relationship with his twin, and the events leading up to the murders. Elias's answers were a tragic, terrifying mosaic of a man completely under the control of his brother. He spoke of his childhood with a palpable sense of fear and subservience, describing Silas as a manipulative, controlling force who'd always seen him as an extension of himself. The Riverfront Strangler murders, he said, were not his idea. They were Silas's art. He described in chilling detail how Silas would pick the victims, sketch out their sculpture, and then send Elias to do the heavy lifting. Elias's confession was a flood of repressed memories and suppressed guilt. He confessed to all the murders, corroborating the evidence from the search and the confessions from Silas. He confirmed that the hair on the first victim was not a mistake. It was a deliberate clue, a game for Silas to play with law enforcement. He even confessed that Silas had a journal, a detailed, disturbing account of every murder, which he had kept hidden in the junkyard he'd reacted to. He was angry at Silas for not having destroyed it, a testament to how deep the manipulation went. The past and the present. Ginny now had a clearer picture of the past. The twins were the products of a broken home, with an abusive father and a meek, passive mother. Silas, the artistic one, was the favored child, while Elias, the stronger one, was used as a tool to do his brother's bidding. The night of the first murder, a petty crime, Ginny learned, was a setup. Elias had been sent to a little rock bar to pick a fight and get arrested. Silas, meanwhile, committed the first murder. He used Elias as a scapegoat, knowing that his brother's arrest would give him a solid alibi, and his DNA would be in the system. The hair was a final, twisted touch. Ginny ended the interrogation, feeling a mixture of pity and revulsion for Elias. He was a monster, but he was also a victim, a man whose life had been systematically destroyed by his twin. She then went to see Silas. He was sitting in his cell, a calm smile on his face. He was not sorry for what he had done. He saw it as a work of art, a masterpiece he had created. Ginny knew that he would never truly understand the horror of his actions. She left the cell, feeling a cold resolve to see him and his brother face the full extent of the law. The day after the twins' arrest was a whirlwind of activity. Ginny, a woman on a mission, worked with a team of detectives to piece together the fractured history of Silas and Elias Finch. They started by tracking down surviving family members and old acquaintances, a difficult task as the twins had been social recluses for years. The family tree of twisted truths. They located an elderly aunt, a frail woman named Eleanor, who lived in a nursing home in a small town an hour away. Ginny and a social worker visited her, and Eleanor, with tears in her eyes, spoke of the twin boys she had known decades ago. They were a strange pair, she said, her voice a reedy whisper. Silas, he was the artist, always drawing, always making things. He had a way with words, too, could make you believe anything he said. Elias, he was the quiet one. Followed Silas everywhere like a shadow. Eleanor described a home life that was a breeding ground for abuse and manipulation. The father, a cruel and controlling man, favored Silas's talent and belittled Elias for his lack of it. The mother, a timid and fearful woman, never intervened. The dynamic was clear. Silas was the puppeteer and Elias was his puppet. The team also spoke to a former neighbor, a man who had worked at the same auto shop as Silas for a short time. He described Silas as a perfectionist, a man who took great pride in his work, but who was also volatile and prone to sudden, violent outbursts. He recalled a time when Silas had smashed a perfectly good engine block with a sledgehammer simply because he was angry about a minor flaw in a part, unraveling the twisted art. Meanwhile, the crime scene investigators were meticulously cataloging every item in the twins' workshop. They found a series of detailed sketches, drawings of the victims, and plans for the twisted sculptures Silas had been creating. They also discovered a hidden workshop within the studio, a small, soundproofed room where the most horrifying art had been created. The investigators also found the journal Elias had mentioned, hidden in the junkyard. It was a chilling document, a first-hand account of the murders, written in a childlike scrawl. Elias wrote about the murders not as a perpetrator, but as a spectator, a tragic victim who was forced to watch and participate in his own descent into madness. The journal revealed the full extent of Silas's manipulation, detailing how he would taunt Elias, threaten him, and even use physical abuse to ensure his compliance. The final piece of the puzzle. The final piece of the puzzle came from an old newspaper clipping, found in a box of personal effects in the twins' childhood home. It was an article about a small-town art show held a year before the first murder. Silas had won first place for a metal sculpture, an intricate piece titled "The Silent Bird." The article mentioned how the sculpture had been inspired by a traumatic childhood memory. Ginny and her team re-examined the sculpture's image, and they found it chillingly similar to one of Silas's recent works, Tangled Truths. The new sculpture, however, had a new grotesque addition, a human-like hand for a beak. Ginny realized that the silent bird was a representation of Elias, his brother, silenced by his abuse, and that Tangled Truths was Silas's final twisted homage to his brother, a symbolic representation of a twisted symbiotic relationship. The cold case was now fully closed. The final threads of a decade-long mystery unraveled. The Riverfront Strangler had a name, a motive, and a terrifying story that Ginny and her team had brought to light. The city of Little Rock could now breathe a collective sigh of relief, knowing that the ghosts of the Riverfront Strangler would no longer haunt its streets. The meticulously assembled evidence, Elias's journal, the chilling sketches, the carefully cataloged trophies, all coalesced into a horrifying tapestry of the twins' reign of terror. Ginny sat in her office late into the night, the glow of her monitor illuminating the grim details. Finn, sensing her solemn mood, lay quietly by her feet. As she read Elias's raw, fractured accounts, the sterile police station faded, replaced by vivid, disturbing flashes of the past. Flashback, the riverfront's shadow. 10 years ago, the first sculpture. The riverfront at night was a tapestry of shifting shadows in the distant home of the city. Elias, thin and trembling, stood hidden by the gnarled roots of an old cypress tree, his heart hammering against his ribs. Silas, a dark silhouette against the moonlit water, moved with a predatory grace. He had watched their target, a lone woman walking her dog, for days. "She's the perfect muse, Elias," Silas had whispered, his breath hot against Elias's ear. "See how she moves? So unaware, so fragile." Elias remembered the paralyzing fear, the sickening lurch in his stomach as Silas had signaled him. Now Elias. The setup, Elias, his hands shaking, had called out, feigning distress. When the woman turned, concern on her face, Silas had moved, swift and brutal. The struggle was brief, muffled by the river's whisper and Elias's own choked sobs. He had been forced to watch, forced to help carry the body deeper into the underbrush, the woman's hair, a single fiery strand, clutched in Silas's hand. "A souvenir," Silas had said, a chilling smile playing on his lips, "for our little game 5 years ago, the warehouse exhibit." The air in the abandoned warehouse was thick with the scent of dust and fear. Silas had found a new, more elaborate studio for his work, a place where he could control every detail. This victim, a young man who'd unwisely accepted a ride from Elias, was tied to a makeshift easel, his eyes wide with terror. Elias, his movements stiff and jerky, was positioned opposite Silas, who held a searing hot metal rod. "Observe, Elias," Silas had commanded, his voice a low, theatrical purr. The human form in its raw state, pleading, desperate, "We are creating meaning." Elias remembered the smell of burnt flesh, the man's choked screams, and his own silent plea for it all to end. Silas had forced him to hold the victim, to participate in the grotesque transformation, turning a living, breathing person into a silent, tormented sculpture of fear. Later, as Silas meticulously worked on a metal bird, adding a sharp beak-like shard, he had hummed a tuneless melody entirely detached from the horror they had just unleashed. "Another piece for the collection," he'd announced, wiping blood from his hands with a scrap of cloth. "Don't you agree, little bird?" 2 years ago, the final brushstroke. The last victim was an older man, a homeless veteran who had found refuge near the river. Silas had grown bolder, more arrogant, less concerned with subtlety. Elias had simply driven him to the chosen spot, his mind numb, his soul a hollowed-out shell. This time, Silas had brought more than just tools. He had brought a camera, documenting his process with disturbing precision. Elias had watched from the shadows as Silas worked, not just ending a life, but meticulously arranging the scene, almost like a perverse photographer composing a shot. He had seen Silas collect a lock of the man's hair, braiding it carefully before placing it into a small, ornate box. "For posterity, Elias," Silas had explained, his eyes gleaming with mad satisfaction. "So they know. So they remember my genius." Ginny closed the journal, the weight of its contents pressing down on her. The twins hadn't just committed murders, they had choreographed them, turning human lives into a canvas for one man's twisted art and another's agonizing obedience. The chills that ran down Ginny's spine were not from the cold night air, but from the chilling understanding of the darkness that resided within the human heart. The ghosts of the Riverfront Strangler had not only been identified, their chilling stories had finally been told. After days of relentless investigation, the time came for the most difficult part of Ginny's job, contacting the victims' families. She and her partner Mason, a detective from the Little Rock Department, had the grim task of delivering the news. The call. The first call was to the family of the last victim, the homeless veteran. His niece, a woman named Clara, who had been searching for him for 2 years, answered the phone. Her voice was hesitant, weary from years of false leads. "This is Detective O'Malley with the Little Rock Cold Case Unit," Ginny began, her voice soft but firm. "We've located a suspect in your uncle's disappearance." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a choked sob. He's gone, isn't he?" Clara whispered. Ginny didn't lie. "Yes, we have reason to believe your uncle was a victim of the Riverfront Strangler." Ginny then explained how the twins had been caught and how they had found a lock of her uncle's braided hair. For Clara, it was a heartbreaking but final piece of closure. The trial. Months later, the courtroom was a stark, somber place. The prosecution's case was a masterpiece of forensic evidence and psychological profiling. The twins' confessions, Elias's journal, the unsettling sketches, and the macabre sculptures all painted a horrifying picture of their crimes. Elias, dressed in a simple prison jumpsuit, sat with his head down, a silent, remorseful figure. His lawyer argued for a reduced sentence, citing his long history of psychological abuse and manipulation at the hands of his twin. Silas, however, was a different story. He wore a crisp suit, and his demeanor was one of utter contempt. He stared at the victims' families, a twisted smile on his face. When he took the stand, he was arrogant and defiant. He confessed to the murders, but insisted they were not crimes but acts of artistic genius. "I created beauty out of chaos," he said, his voice cold and emotionless. "I gave them a purpose, a final form." The families of the victims sat in stony silence, their faces etched with grief and anger. One by one, they took the stand, each giving a tearful and impassioned victim impact statement. They spoke of the pain, the fear, and the years of not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. As the jury delivered its verdict, guilty on all counts, Ginny felt a wave of relief. Justice had been served. The monsters who had haunted Little Rock for a decade would finally be put away. But as the bailiff led the twins away, Silas's eyes found Ginny's. He gave her a final, chilling smile, a gesture of a man who still believed he had won. It was a reminder that even in victory, the ghosts of the Riverfront Strangler would forever be a part of her story.